Welcome to the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Our mission is to help executives thrive as cyber risk managers. Your hosts are Kip Boyle, Virtual Chief Information Security Officer at Cyber Risk Opportunities, and Jake Bernstein, Partner at the law firm of K&L Gates. Visit them at cr-map.com and klgates.com.
So, Kip, what are we going to talk about today in episode 124 of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast?
This is a cool episode. I've actually had this on the in the queue for a while. What we're going to do today is we're going to learn about what happened to this $100 million Texas company. They were called, and I just gave it away, United Structures of America. And they got struck by ransomware in 2019. And I want to unpack this. This is a really interesting case.
Well, Kip, as you know, a lot of companies get struck by ransomware. So why focus an entire episode on this one particular incident?
This one's really unique. I think it's a rare chance to know some of the details we typically don't find out. And is also this case also has a very unfortunate outcome. And because of the outcome and because of the details, I think this is worth spending an entire episode on. There is a remarkable amount of transparency on this ransomware attack. And I want to tell you how that came about. The first reason why it came about is because they had to file for bankruptcy as a result of this ransomware attack. And their bankruptcy filing was made public shortly after they filed the paperwork on January 11th, 2022. So about a year ago. And most interestingly, and in combination with the bankruptcy filing, was that the former president of the company gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal about the cyber attack, the resulting bankruptcy, and I think he was very candid, and I think he shared some really insightful experiences he had going through that, and I think our listeners would find his perspective helpful.
Well, that is fascinating, and I think it's definitely going to be worth this episode. Let's go ahead and give a profile of USA, United Structures of America, then review the timeline of the ransomware attack, and then we can discuss the aftermath. How's that work?
Yep. That's you're a mind reader. Either that or you read the script before we started, because that's exactly how I want to do it.
Possibly both.
Yeah, possibly both. I also want to try to stay consistent with the data breach investigations report, because we cover that report every year, and every time we cover it, we always say there's a difference between a breach and an incident, and I'm alleging that this was a breach, not just an incident. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a great example of how you can't always just take definitions and easily apply them to any particular situation. This is what makes the law so challenging at times, because here it is, right? The DBIR defines incident as a security event that compromises the integrity, confidentiality, or availability of an information asset. So, any successful ransomware attack, by definition, is an incident, like no question. A breach is an incident. So here we are. It's a subset, right? We've talked about this before.
Yep.
That results in the confirmed disclosure, not just potential exposure, of data to an unauthorized party. In other words, a data breach compromises the confidentiality attribute, and we've gotten to the point with ransomware that we have to assume breach, which is an interesting way of putting it, because it is, yes, I think we don't know for sure that this particular ransomware event resulted in the theft of the data, what we call double extortion, and you'll talk about that in a second. But I think, and I'm just going to go off script briefly and complain slightly about the DBIR's definitions here, because let's just say for a second that this isn't a breach, because we didn't know that we don't know if the data has been if there's been confirmed disclosure. A ransomware attack that results in a bankruptcy doesn't feel like merely an incident, does it?
Right.
And I think there's a little bit of that going on here as well. So But I think, I'm glad you brought this up because it just illustrates, I was having a conversation not too long ago with someone who wanted or thought that, like, why can't we just, program a bunch of algorithms to apply the law? Like, why is it so hard? And this is just a perfect example of why, we just don't have computing technology yet that's able to handle the nuance of life. So putting that aside for the moment, double extortion ransomware, like, the timing seems right. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. So there's a couple of other things I need to add in here in order to round this out. So first of all, this breach, as I would like to refer to it, this breach happened in 2019. Well, 2019 was the time when this double extortion ransomware technique started to become public. So the Maze gang was operating a ransomware as a service, and they're not in business anymore. But they double extorted. I know business, right? It's loosely.
Right. Well, and I was going to say, it's also like, we don't know if the same exact people are just have reopened under a new name.
Well, how many times does a restaurant fail? And
I believe quite a few.
And it reopens under a new name, but the same people are working.
Yeah, fairly often.
So I'm assuming, that's probably going on here as well. I think it's a safe bet. But Maze double extorted an American company called Allied Universal in 2019. And the United Structures ransomware attack happened about the same time. Now, the reason why that data didn't become public, the reason it wasn't released is because, as you're going to find out, United Structures paid the ransom. So there was no incentive or there was a much lower incentive for their data to be publicly exposed as a result. So anyway, so this is my thinking about the time period that this happened. But certainly today in 2023, we're talking about multi-level extortion. We're talking about assumed breach. And so I think this is a reasonable way to think about it today.
Okay, I totally agree.
Okay, so so let's unpack that a little bit. Multi-level extortion. It's not just double extortion anymore, is it?
It is not. It is not at all. And we see multi-level extortion. The encryption of the files, of course, is just the beginning, and how pedestrian, only encrypting all your files. The second step, as you said, is threatening to release those files in clear text to the open internet. The next one is followed by denial of service attacks, and then moving on to direct communications between the cyber attackers and the victims, customers, and other stakeholders.
Mm-hmm.
So what is that? At least four levels of extortion there?
At least, yeah.
At least. But you know what? That is an episode for another time. We have covered direct communication with customers extortion technique back in episode 51.
Yep.
That was the cyber extortion of patients. And since we have show notes now, we'll put a link to that episode in the show notes.
Right. And that's an example of where, just because you read off the multi-level extortion in a certain order doesn't mean that it's always going to go like that. Right.
Yeah. I mean, a ransomware multi-level extortion almost always does start with encryption.
Yeah.
But the rest of it is more flexible.
That's right. It's like a floor routine in gymnastics.
Yeah.
Who knows how they're going to go next? Okay, let's get back to United Structures and see what we can learn from this case. And so let's learn a little bit more about who United Structures actually was. So what do we know about them?
Okay, well, so we know that they were a Houston-based steel manufacturing and design company. They were founded in 1980 and were privately held. They purchased raw steel from suppliers, processed the steel to the specifications of their customers, as well as designed steel-based buildings.
Mm-hmm.
They had 450 employees at the height of their business. The president was a guy named Dane Drake, who, according to his LinkedIn profile, had worked there for 24 years. And then outside of the bankruptcy filing, the United Structures attributed its closure to crippling, this is a quote, crippling business circumstances that were not foreseeable. Specifically, the company cited the lingering effects of all those steel tariffs, financing issues, and, quote, a recent cyber attack. So, and you and I were talking about this before we started recording. Yes, there were other factors in play. And no, we cannot predict what the future would have held for this company without the cyber attack. But I think, the on their own, none of those things I think would have necessarily led to the bankruptcy of this company. But I think that the ransomware attack, particularly after we talk about what happened with it, I think it was just particularly brutal.
Yeah, it was definitely a piling on, right? Probably no one of these things would have liquidated them, but this cyber attack definitely pushed them over the edge. So, all right, let's now get into the timeline of the attack itself. Okay, so again, I love this because we're getting a really good, transparent view into what actually happened. So the first thing we need to know is when did they get exploited? And based on the forensics and what was released in those two sources that I mentioned at the top of the episode, there was an IT administrator, and that person had a laptop which was breached on May 25th, 2019. And why was that laptop breached? Well, because the password to the IT admin's account was the address of the business. And that had been their password for at least 6 years, maybe even longer. And so that's how the attackers came in as administrators, and that's how they were able to set up the ransomware attack.
That is very, very unfortunate. What are some other details of this of the attack here? What other timeline data do you have? Because I know you've got a bunch.
There's a bunch, but I want to make a comment about this, the entry point. Okay, now I don't want to disparage this individual, but I do want to reemphasize something we talked about recently, which is your IT people are not your cybersecurity people.
My goodness, no!
This is a big mistake that I see senior decision makers making all the time, especially in the mid-market. Where they think that their IT people are going to be able to handle all that, and it's another example of many where that just was not true. Okay, so the president, Dane Drake, said that the attack became visible at about 6 a.m. on May 29th. So it was about 4 days after the breach and right after the Memorial Day weekend, and that's consistent, right, with this idea that these cyber attackers love to mess with us around holiday times and when we're at our least capable of responding. And so that there's a lot of authenticity there. They had 400 computers altogether, desktop computers and servers, and every one of them became inoperable. And by noon that day, right? So within 6 hours of discovering, all production had ceased. None of the steel was getting processed. None of the orders were being fulfilled. And I found some quotes from Dane Drake, the president, which I thought were just, again, so insightful. So he says, quote, "At first, I was optimistic. This was another unfortunate event. I was under the impression that we had a fully operational backup system. It was installed, and so I wasn't terribly concerned until around the noon hour. But I realized that the backup system was installed but never initiated and not properly ready. And one of the many lessons I learned is to always have fire drills and dry runs to make sure the backup systems are operational and working properly." Ouch. What an awful way to learn that lesson.
Yeah. And and you're right. I think this is such one of those, the transparency here makes it a very useful learning exercise for folks, for our listeners.
Yeah.
Even though it's really, it gets very sad, as we will see.
Yeah, it gets even more sad. And we're recording this in between Christmas and New Year's, so it's a bit of a blue Christmas thing as we. Yes, but okay. So the ransomware, how much did they want? 2 Bitcoin per IP address. And that meant at the time, right, to unlock all 400 machines was $11 million, just over $11 million. And the president of the company, he paid it. But here's another interesting wrinkle that the transparency brings. He paid it on June 1st, and it was late. And he said the reason why he had to pay it late is because, quote, he was not familiar with how to get a hold of Bitcoin, and it was not as easy as I expected. And I think that's a quote that kind of sums up a lot of what we're going to hear.
It does, although keep in mind that this was back in 2019, also known as pre-FTX, literally. It may have just started. And you know what, honestly, I don't know how easy it is to get Bitcoin these days. I still don't think it's very easy.
Well, and as easy as it may or may not be procedurally,
right?
What I know is that there are waiting periods, right?
Yes.
There's actually holding periods so you can't just, rapidly acquire and move Bitcoin. And so if you as an organization think that you might pay a ransom, then it behooves you to purchase Bitcoin in advance so that it's available when you need to move it, or, have some arrangement with a financial institution who has a reserve of cryptocurrency that can move it for you, however you do it. But here is an example where, the president had to scramble and probably had to sweet talk the attackers into being patient and this, just extra stress.
Yep, exactly. And I'm sure the attackers were patient because they have nothing to lose by waiting.
Right.
If they can
but he doesn't know that, right?
Because
he's never faced this before.
Yeah,
he has no clue about this. He's learning as he goes. Unfortunately,
I was just going to ask you. So how much did they get back?
Well, so they paid the ransom, this $11 million, but they got a key, but it didn't really work, and so they only got a limited amount of their data back. And then the hackers demanded even more ransom to unlock the rest, right? So they had a knife, they plunged it in this company's back, and they were just twisting it.
Then they
slowly,
twisted it,
and just kept doing that.
No,
so it's awful.
It is awful. And out of curiosity, when did this company tell their customers that they'd suffered a pretty serious attack?
It wasn't until the second week. And, we've talked about this before, public relations for the preservation of your number one asset, which is your reputation. I don't know, because I can't tell from the sources. I don't know if that was based on a fear that they, like, oh my gosh, we can't tell anybody. I don't know if that was based on a cover-up attempt, or, and I think this is just as likely, they were so distracted with dealing with the attack that they just didn't even think about it.
Well, and I suspect there was at least one other factor, which is they also didn't know how big of a deal it would be.
Right.
Right. I think all three of those things is over the course of this time, like the guy said, he didn't think it was that bad at first, and then you're trying to deal with it, and it's like, yeah, I mean, I can understand why. Again, this was 2019. I think that was really just the very beginning of kind of the somewhat now historical ransomware surge over the pandemic. But that is, it's interesting. So anyway, here's what ultimately happened to United Structures. So the ransomware attack wiped out United Structures data relating to accounts receivable, accounts payable, current orders, customer information, the current CNC machinery files, along with essentially all of its business data. Ouch.
And everybody knows what CNC is, right?
Yeah. What is that? I know. I always say Kip, do we know what CNC stands for?
We do know.
It's not CAD, which is computer aided design.
Right. No, it's not. It's computer numerical control.
That's right.
And what this means is that these days, when you are machining parts, you've got a chunk of aluminum and you want to shape it into a certain shape or whatever. It used to be that a person would stand at a lathe or whatever, and they would do that by hand. These days, they actually have machines that automate all that. And these CNC files are like the program that tells the machine what to cut, how deep to cut, how long to cut, all that stuff, right? So without those programs, those CNC files, the machines have no idea how to manufacture parts.
Right. So unsurprisingly, it had to shut down its Houston facility and laid off all of those approximately 450 employees by late 2019. The company struggled for years to reconstruct its data and was eventually forced into bankruptcy and ended up filing its declaration, like you said at the beginning, on January 11th, 2022.
Yeah. Gosh. So what was that? 2 years of wallowing in the mire of, downstream from this attack. I mean, this is so wrong and awful, just on every level. Why is it that companies that are doing their best out there, they have these payrolls, people have careers, so on and so forth, meaningful work, serving customers, and then they just get wiped out by a tsunami of digital, awfulness. It's just wrong, and that's why we're in business.
I mean, it is to some degree. We don't like this at all. And just to go back to the causes of the bankruptcy and the destruction of the company, if you think about just logically, and we don't know this is a little bit of speculation, but the tariffs, just any macroeconomic situation, like any company can weather. Most companies can weather that kind of stuff. It's cyclical. It happens. But when you look at what this company lost, like they literally couldn't operate. Like it was bad enough, it's bad enough to lose your accounts receivable and accounts payable. But if we just kind of play some, what if games, if all they'd lost was their AR and their accounts payable and even their current orders, that would have been so obnoxious, but they probably could have reconstructed that over time and gotten things going. The problem is that they couldn't produce anything.
Right.
At least that's kind of my this is
right.
This is my argument. My supposition here is that without those CNC machinery files, and we often talk about like protect the crown jewels, right? And I think this is really a helpful, just a quick thing to mention is that when you think about what are our crown jewels, right? Well, first of all, it 100% depends on your business, right? It totally does. But I can tell you right now, accounts receivable and accounts payable, your CRM, those are important to all businesses. Like, I get that. I agree. I'm not certain, and I'm not going to say this categorically, but I'm not certain that for a majority of industries, those should be considered the crown jewels. If your entire business is based off of marketing, maybe then the CRM is your crown jewel. Maybe
we know some
right?
companies get acquired because of their customer list, right? Not all, but
some, and sometimes that's not just the list, but it's the contracts and the existing relationships and that kind of stuff.
It's the book of business.
It's the book of business, right? Which is much more complex than just the digital data, right?
It's the contracts and everything.
Yeah, I mean, just a good example is like a company that got ransomware like this, like someone could still buy them for their book of business because that book of business still exists.
Right.
Problem here though is that I would argue that their CNC machinery files, whatever allows you to convert your labor and time into money is really should be considered the crown jewel of any given business and
raw materials.
Yeah. Well, and yes.
In this case, because they had steel coming in one door, finished product going out another.
Yeah. So that's kind of what that's a better way of saying it. It's it's kind of that black box that lets you, whatever operates within the black box that lets you take, some input, whatever that is, whether it's only time and energy or whether it's time, energy, and raw materials, and produce something that you can sell. I think people should think of that as their crown jewels. So
I agree. And in a non-manufacturing sense, right, where we're just knowledge workers, right? We're selling software or advice or whatever it is. You have the equivalent of CNC files, right? Whether it's computer programs, or document templates or working papers, whatever it is you draw on in order to be able to deliver services to customers or digital deliverables or whatever. So it's not just manufacturing. It really is applicable across the board. So
Oh no, it really is.
I'm glad you took a moment to make this point. Okay, so let's keep going.
And to finish my thoughts on this is like, okay, so obviously they didn't ask to be attacked, but they were. But also, I think it's important to recognize that they weren't ready.
Not at all.
And I think our listeners can learn a lot from this breach /incident / definitions are challenging. / there'll always be a job for lawyers. Let's continue to do that by reviewing some quotes from the president of the steelmaker and design firm, who's Dane Drake, that he gave in the June 2022 Wall Street Journal article.
And think about it, right? That was 3 years after he first stumbled into this. So he's had a lot of time to think about it.
All right, so here we go. These are all quotes. If I vary, I will make it clear. So first one, my normal concerns were overtime and production and supply chain. And now all of that was taken away. That's an interesting quote. And what do we say, Kip? We say that cybersecurity really needs to become just another business risk. And this guy is saying my normal business risks are overtime, which always costs more money, production, supply chain.
What he's saying is I'm so distracted by this event, and this event has taken away from me my normal concerns through the distraction and the fact that he has no capability to manage his business, right? Because all of his levers and knobs that he's used to having to pay attention to don't work anymore, right? There's no way for him to manage his business. Plus, he's got these crazy people breathing down his neck. And so I think we've said this before, where cyber risk is kind of the ultimate business risk, because in one fell swoop, it can decimate you. It can eclipse all other business risks.
Yeah,
and completely fill your field division.
It certainly can. Here's another quote. We did not have an incident response team, but I was able to obtain that by noon the day of the attack, and they helped me. It was amazing how much information they found so quickly of how porous and naked I was to the world, if you will, from a cybersecurity standpoint. This is a common sentiment that I hear is, once an incident happens and the forensic team, whoever it is, gets in there, almost always it's like, hey, did you know this, this, and this? And we've both had clients
that's right
who are kind of shocked about it. So
they can't see it until somebody shows it to them, and they're in a receptive mind.
Yep. Yes. Okay. Next one. I had no idea who I'd invoiced the month or 2 months before. I rebuilt my accounting system with bank statements. Not the way I recommend anybody to do that. Yeah, that's definitely no fun at all.
Oh, well, we know what he did for some of those 3 years following the attack.
Yeah.
Is he tried to rebuild his finances.
We also had tax liabilities, and if I need to pay or if I'm audited, we're in a situation where we don't have records to support us. That's a really interesting point, because I think it's one that gets forgotten a lot of the time when we're talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
So often we look at the short-term consequences of a ransomware attack. And, this is a really good example of a longer-term one.
Yeah. And on a related note, there was a payroll automation company that people had outsourced to, a lot of people, who I think it was in early 22 or late 21. And I can't remember that part, but there was a payroll outage, and a lot of companies got in trouble because they didn't meet payroll on time. And so their states got involved and penalized them because they didn't pay workers on time.
Wage and hour claims.
They didn't remit payroll taxes on time. I mean, it was a complete and utter failure, in the HR world, because of a ransomware attack.
Yep.
So these second order effects are really interesting.
They really are. Next quote. I did not have cyber insurance. Well, and just as the quotes continue here, and that is something that I would recommend today with any business. Our caveat, if you can get it in 2019,
You could
This is
get it.
almost an unforgivable sin. Anyone could have gotten it for not much money for pretty darn good coverage.
Yep.
Here's a great quote. Because the enemy, if you will, is always adapting, and I was not. That's just such a concise way of summarizing everything we say.
Yeah.
And then, I like this one too. Arrogance is not welcome in this environment. It is not.
Yeah. I
We've
gotta tell
seen
you.
this.
Yeah. Dane Drake, I love the candor of his comments, right? His willingness to be vulnerable in this interview with the Wall Street Journal, his willingness to admit, after having reflected on it, and after having lived in the pain of it, to be able to say these things out loud and on record is stunningly refreshing.
It is, and you know what the thing is like, this is true of so many people. Like this, this individual has the guts to say it out loud, but all of these things are, so many people could have given these quotes.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the other thing about them, is that they're so broadly applicable to anybody in his situation.
Well, here's one that makes me sad.
I thought you'd enjoy this one.
Quote, I did not have any legal assistance. Well, okay, so that really does flow from the previous quote, which was, I did not have cyber insurance. So it's not surprising. And a lot of law firms, the breach response work is still pretty specialized, right? There's a handful of law firms out there, a relative handful, that do it a lot because they're on an insurance panel. And then there's an even smaller, thimbleful that has, that isn't on a panel, but that still has incident response capabilities. Most of your standard business lawyer, business law firms, particularly small ones, just aren't going to have that kind of ability. So, that's totally predictable. And then last, let's end with, there's two questions here from the Wall Street Journal in this interview. What do you think about cybersecurity training for employees is the first one. And what are your thoughts about that, having gone through this particularly damaging attack? And this is his response. I think it's extremely important. You need to have training. You need to test employees to see if they open phishing emails. If the employee fails or does not take their training on time, there should be constructive disciplinary actions as a result, because that person that does not value your security could be a point of breach. Easier said than done, but that's something where security and HR need to be aligned 100%. Well, what do you think about that, Kip?
Episode 88 and 89 of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast talked all about that, right? Yeah. How to make sure that cybersecurity is everyone's job. And that's what he's saying here in other words. But I love his words, because these are the plain spoken words of a senior decision maker who has recognized that this is a business risk that should be treated like other business risks. Like if you violate company policy, you go through constructive disciplinary process, right? So, and that could be like, I showed up to work drunk, or I stole company property, or I drove the forklift around in the warehouse in a very unsafe way.
Yep. Well, the funny thing is too, is like all of those things would be automatic. Like nobody would question that. Nobody would ever even push back on discipline for that kind of stuff. I mean, you could combine them too. What if you came to work drunk and then drove the forklift while drunk, in a crazy fashion? Like, you probably just get fired.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that, no one has ever said that, failing one phishing exercise is grounds for termination.
I don't think it should be.
And no, and I don't think it should be either.
But there should be some consequence, right?
There should be some consequence, but more importantly, it's the inability to learn should be concerning, right?
Yeah.
The first one, no. The second one, no. But if I'm not categorically saying 3 strikes you're out is correct either, but like there needs to be some real heart-to-heart conversations. If you have an employee who, 3 times or more just keeps clicking.
That's right. Right. With reckless abandon. So in this quote that you just read off, Mr. Drake talked about something called constructive disciplinary actions. Well, another term for that is a progressive disciplinary system. And these systems are designed specifically to catch and call people and get them back on track. In other words, employers who use these systems are saying, we don't want to fire you. We just want you to follow the rules. And so we're going to start with a verbal warning. And if you do it again, we're going to move that to a written warning. And if you do it again, then, double secret written warning, whatever the system is, right? And it progresses up to the point where, fourth, fifth time, whatever the system is, you are now, a person who's demonstrated that you have no interest in complying with the rules. So we're going to say goodbye to you now. So you have every chance to get back on track, and you haven't taken it. And so, we're going to part ways. And I think that is how companies should be treating violations of cybersecurity policy, including, phishing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just to play, not devil's advocate, but just to illustrate that there's many ways to skin this particular cat, you could also have a situation where assuming it was possible and compatible with someone's, work duties, they could get an increasingly locked down machine, right?
That's right.
And there's all kinds of things that you could do. Eventually, though, I think what would happen is you get to a point with someone where you can't lock down the machine anymore without preventing them from doing their job.
Yeah.
And they're still doing it. Like, this can put you out of business. So I think it's really important to remember that.
It's huge. It's such a huge risk these days. I mean, 15, 20 years ago, it was just really, the computer would get a virus on it. You'd have to scrub the virus off, and somebody would, not be able to work for half a day or something like that.
It'd be annoying.
Yeah, but it's spiraled completely out of control now.
It really has.
So unfortunately, Mr. Drake and everybody who was working with him learned the hard way that cyber is a business risk and has to be treated that way. Now, before we close out the episode, there's another second order effect here that I think we should talk about, right? We talked about paying taxes, we talked about payroll, all that sort of thing. So let's talk about their bankruptcy filing. So we know that they didn't have financial records because Mr. Drake said that they lost their financial records, and he had to do his best to reconstruct them with bank statements. But bank statements don't contain everything you need. That's just cash, right? It's just a record of
cash,
cash in, cash out. It's not an accrual accounting system. So they were obviously missing a lot. How do you file bankruptcy without disclosing all your assets and all your liabilities? How does that work?
Well, so I will say first that I'm not a bankruptcy lawyer. So this is just kind of high level understanding of how bankruptcy works. But essentially, this company, United Structures of America, qualified to file under subchapter 5 of chapter 11. So that means that it was still required to file schedules and a statement of financial affairs. They were able to avoid the petition date filing requirements by submitting a statement under oath explaining their lack of financial information, which of course was it's encrypted and we don't have access to it.
Right.
And as a debtor filing under subchapter 5, United Structures was able to confirm a plan of liquidation without the approval of any creditors, who I'm sure were quite frustrated with the lack of information regarding their finances. But what are you going to do, right? This is part of the reality. And then finally, United Structures avoided the requirement of filing a disclosure statement in which debtors are typically required to provide adequate information for creditors to make an informed decision about the debtor's plan to exit bankruptcy.
There was no plan to exit bankruptcy.
There was no plan to exit bankruptcy. This is it. Again, not a bankruptcy lawyer, but that is kind of a high level overview of what would have happened.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't imagine that this type of bankruptcy happens very often, where you're allowed to essentially, kind of go through this trap door where you don't have to do this and you don't have to do that. And there just seemed like there was a lot of unusualness here. And I got to think the creditors probably at first were like, "Oh, BS! Of course you have all this. You just don't want to give it to us, right?" I mean, I got to imagine there was a lot of incredulity.
And back in 2019, I imagine, yes. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if this has happened much more often in the recent past, simply because of cyber attacks.
Right.
But I have no personal knowledge of how often this happens.
But I just think about the creditors, right? Now there's a new credit risk in the landscape, isn't there? That an organization would get hit by a ransomware attack. It would be the straw that breaks the camel's back. It goes bankrupt, and they go bankrupt with no records.
Yeah, no, that's brutal.
As a creditor, what are you going to do? You got nothing, right?
Yeah. Well, hopefully you're a secured creditor.
Hopefully. Because there are tangible assets in this case.
Yes, in this case.
But in a knowledge-based company, there wouldn't be. There would be no tangible assets. There'd be nothing to sell because everything would be encrypted and unavailable. All your intellectual property would be gone.
Gone. Absolutely.
So I just find, again, this case is so worthy of its own podcast episode because it's allowing us to see these second order effects in addition to some of the other things that we're able to look at here. Okay, so let's take a moment and as we wrap up the episode and just ask the question, United Structures wasn't ready for this and they paid the ultimate price for it. What should they have done to survive this ransomware attack?
Well, obviously we don't have another 40 minutes on this episode. So I will mention episode 63, which is called A Quick Look at the Essential 8 Mitigations. Those are designed to reduce the risk of malware of all kinds, including ransomware. And we'll put a link to that episode in the show notes. But I would say, what's almost extra sad about this is that they at least ostensibly had someone at least thought to buy a backup solution. It wasn't configured. It was never run. So obviously, 0 point, you don't really get any points for that there. But, I think what that makes me think is that, gosh, the dangers of checkbox style managing cyber risk, right? It's like someone just asked, well, do we have a backup system? And it's not a lie. It's not false for someone to have answered, yes, we bought one. And that's the danger of this is a perfect illustration of the dangers of checkbox security. Yeah, we check the box. We have a backup system. But nobody asked, okay, does it configured? Does it work? Has it been tested? Right? Yeah. And you just can't stop with the do we have it?
Right. Look at these blinky lights. Isn't it impressive?
Yeah.
And you know what? This is a great thing for you to talk about because I know from working with customers who are trying to get cyber insurance policies that the insurance carriers are actually asking the question, have you tested your backup data system and how quickly can you restore everything? Like that's being asked now. So you have to have an answer to that. So that's good.
Well, and that's very good too, because let's be honest, like I'm not, as everybody knows by now, having listened to me for 120-ish episodes. I think I've missed one or two here and there. I'm not a security engineer, but my argument I will make is that if you are prepared, you probably should be able to recover from this kind of attack within a business week.
Yeah.
Maybe even faster. Maybe slower. Again, everything's going to be a little bit different. But the insurance companies here, they need to stop paying ransoms. And one of the ways that they're going to minimize that is they're just not going to insure you if you haven't tested your backup and know that you can get back up and running in a reasonable period of time.
If you lie on the application and say you can do it lie. and then you can't.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, it's not likely you're going to be referred to prosecution for lying on the application, although you could be. Really, what's likely to happen is they're going to refund your premium and say policy withdrawn. And
they may not even refund the premium. That's a breach.
Okay.
That's actually and
breach of contract.
You're not going to get So you're correct. You're correct that you're never going to get prosecuted for perjury on that. However, what would be most bad for you is if you go through a claim process, the insurance company spends money defending you, figuring it out, and then discovers afterward that you lied about having this. They will sue you. They will sue you for all of that money, and you also I guarantee you have sacrificed whatever premiums you've been paying. So,
Most importantly, you've lost the recovery resources.
Oh, totally.
That the policy should provide. So again, checkbox security will not help you here.
Nope.
So anyway, okay. Any final words, Jake?
No, I think we've really hit this one out of the park.
Yeah, I feel really good about this, and I hope our listeners found this to be useful, insightful. And if you're a cybersecurity professional, you should probably ask your senior decision makers to listen to this episode, so that they can more fully appreciate the business aspect of this particular case, and talk with them about it and say, what do you think? And try to get that conversation going. Enrich your conversation with your senior decision makers about this topic. But okay, so that wraps up this episode of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. And today we learned what happened to a $100 million Texas company that was called United Structures of America after it got struck by ransomware in 2019. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Thanks for joining us today on the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. If you need to overcome a cybersecurity hurdle that's keeping you from growing your business profitably, then please visit us at cr-map.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.